Have you ever found yourself stuck in conversations with people who just can't stop bragging, constantly talk about their struggles, or never seem to listen to what you're saying? These interactions can be frustrating and leave you feeling drained and misunderstood. In this video, we'll dive deep into the different types of individuals you might encounter, from the perpetual braggarts to those who dominate every conversation with their difficulties, and even the ones who simply don't listen. By understanding their behaviors and the underlying reasons behind them, you'll discover effective strategies to navigate these challenging interactions with confidence and ease. Stay tuned until the end to learn practical tips that will not only improve your relationships, but also enhance your well-being. If you're not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. If you like the topic of this video, please comment 1. If you don't, please comment 0 to let me know how I can improve and make better videos for you. Now, let's begin. It's almost impossible to avoid the kind of people who seem to be constantly bragging about themselves. You know the ones, those individuals who every time you cross paths with them, can't help but fill the conversation with stories of their achievements. It often feels like they are using every moment as an opportunity to remind you just how wonderful their lives are, whether it's about their successes, their flawless family, or their social standing. And let's be honest, after a while, it can become downright exhausting. You start to feel uneasy around them as if you're merely an audience member for their never-ending monologue. These people often take great pride in sharing details about their high educational background, making it sound as if they've achieved something so grand that it puts them on a different level from everyone else. Or maybe it's their kids. They'll rave about how their children are the best in class, exceptional in sports, or destined for greatness. And then there's their spouse, who of course holds some prestigious job with a high social status. It's as if they're trying to paint the picture of a perfect life, one that's just a little bit better than everyone else's. And yet, the most frustrating part is how unaware they seem of the discomfort they cause. What makes it even more unbearable is the way they deliver these self-aggrandizing speeches. It's not just a casual remark. No, they speak as if they're on a stage broadcasting their successes not just to you, but to the entire room, or even the world. So they raise their voices as if the whole cafe, restaurant, or wherever you might be needs to hear about their latest triumphs. The worst part is, they don't just do it in direct conversation. Even when they're on the phone, they somehow manage to steer the conversation towards bragging, ensuring that everyone around can hear. It's as if they live in a constant state of needing validation, and they don't care who gives it to them, whether it's their friend on the other end of the line or strangers sitting nearby. Then there are the more subtle, yet equally annoying types of brags, the ones that come disguised as self-deprecation or concern. For instance, they'll say something like, "Oh, my child doesn't study at all, but the teacher said they're so talented. They scored so high on the test, even though they don't try." What they're doing here is humble bragging, trying to make it seem like they're worried about their child, but in reality, they're just showcasing how naturally gifted their offspring is. It's a sneaky kind of boasting that's meant to evoke admiration while pretending to be modest. And if you're not careful, you might find yourself nodding along, only to realize later that you've been drawn into their web of self-praise. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. Even in everyday conversations, they manage to sneak in these little moments of bragging. For example, they might casually say, "Oh, our house is so big that we had to hire a gardener because it's too much to maintain." On the surface, it sounds like an innocent comment about home care, but the underlying message is clear. Look how grand my life is compared to yours. The problem is not just the brag itself, but the complete lack of awareness about how their words might make others feel. They don't stop to think that maybe not everyone lives in a spacious house or has the means to hire help. It's this absence of sensitivity, this inability to see how their constant self-promotion could alienate or upset others, that grates on people. It's almost like they're trapped in a cycle of one-upmanship. When someone else shares something, they immediately feel the need to outdo them. Have you ever been in a conversation where you mentioned something positive in your life, only for the other person to come back with something bigger, better, and more impressive? It's as if they can't stand not being the center of attention, not being the one with the most remarkable story. And what's truly ironic is that, more often than not, these individuals are well aware of how unpleasant it is to listen to others brag. Yet they can't seem to stop themselves from doing it, as if they are trapped in their own need for validation. But why do they do it? Why do some people feel the need to constantly talk about themselves in such a boastful way? The truth is that many of these individuals likely struggle with deep feelings of inferiority. While on the outside they present themselves as confident and successful, inside they are often plagued by insecurities. They might fear that if others knew their weaknesses, they would no longer be admired or respected. So they overcompensate by bragging, hoping to mask their vulnerabilities with stories of success. It's almost sad when you think about it. Beneath the surface, their constant boasting is a cry for approval. They want to be seen as important and valuable, but they don't believe that just being themselves is enough. So they put up this front, using their achievements or the successes of their family as a way to build themselves up. For them, bragging becomes a defense mechanism, a way to protect their fragile self-esteem. And if they can convince others, and maybe even themselves, that they are successful, then perhaps they won't have to face their insecurities. What's more, many of these people probably don't even realize how transparent their behavior is. They believe that by boasting about their education, their wealth, or their family, they are projecting confidence. But in reality, their behavior often reveals just how insecure they are. It's the people who feel most unsure of themselves, who tend to brag the loudest, as if by raising their voices and sharing their achievements, they can drown out the doubt that nags at them inside. On the flip side, those who are truly confident rarely feel the need to brag. People who are secure in themselves, and who come from a place of genuine self-worth, don't need to seek validation through constant boasting. Their confidence speaks for itself. You'll notice that those who are truly accomplished or come from well-established backgrounds often don't feel the need to bring it up. They don't have to remind others of their status or achievements because they are secure in who they are. True confidence doesn't shout, it doesn't need to. So, the next time you find yourself stuck in a conversation with someone who can't stop bragging, take a moment to reflect on what's going on beneath the surface. That incessant need to talk about themselves likely hides a lot of anxiety and feelings of inferiority. But just because they are struggling with their issues doesn't mean you have to endure their endless self-promotion. You can gently guide the conversation in a more meaningful direction, offering them an opportunity to talk about something deeper than just their successes. Help them see that they don't need to prove anything to be worthy of admiration. Real confidence comes from within, and no amount of boasting will ever be a substitute for that. In the end, we all want to feel valued and important. But when we rely on external achievements or the approval of others to feel good about ourselves, we end up chasing validation in ways that can push people away. The irony of bragging is that, while it's meant to make us look better in the eyes of others, it often has the opposite after effect. Instead of admiration, it breeds discomfort and frustration in those around us. The sooner we learn to find our worth within ourselves, the less we'll need to rely on boasting, and the more genuine connections we'll be able to build with others. There's another type of person we've all encountered at some point in our lives, those who always seem to talk about their struggles and difficulties, no matter what the conversation is about. It doesn't matter where the discussion begins or what the topic might be. These individuals always find a way to shift the conversation back to their hardships. Have you ever been in a situation like that, where you're talking about something lighthearted or even just catching up, and suddenly the person you're speaking with starts telling you about the latest personal crisis they've been through? It can leave you feeling emotionally drained, as if the weight of their problems has suddenly been placed on your shoulders. These individuals often lack a clear understanding of what communication truly means. They don't seem to grasp that a conversation is meant to be a back-and-forth exchange where both people have a chance to share and listen. Instead, they dominate the dialogue with their woes, making the conversation feel one-sided and, frankly, exhausting. Over time, these interactions become boring and repetitive, and you can start to feel a sense of estrangement creeping in. You may even find yourself avoiding them altogether, simply because you know that every conversation will end up revolving around their problems. What's more frustrating is that they don't even realize the impact their behavior has on others. They seem unaware of how tiring it can be to constantly listen to someone else's troubles. You try to be supportive, but after hearing the same complaints over and over again, it's easy to lose interest. You want to be empathetic, but it becomes difficult when the conversation always circles back to their issues. leaving no room for anything else. It's as if they're trapped in a cycle of negativity, unable to break free from the narrative of their difficulties. And sometimes, in the middle of what seems like a normal conversation, they'll suddenly bring up family drama. Out of nowhere, they'll start talking about what they've done for their family, or even worse, the mistakes their family members have made. It's particularly frustrating when they begin to brag about these stories, as if their family's hardships are somehow a badge of honor. It's one thing to share a difficult experience for the sake of connecting with someone, but it's another to repeatedly dwell on it without considering how it affects the person listening. Now, it's important to note that there are times when sharing personal stories, even about difficulties, can bring people closer. If the hardships are something that others can relate to common experiences that resonate with everyone, then it's different. In those cases, sharing challenges can lead to laughter and bonding over shared memories. Everyone can empathize, and the conversation can still be enjoyable. But when the stories are unique to that person, when they delve into family issues that no one else can relate to, people's interest fades fast. Take, for example, the topic of family issues, particularly when it comes to mother-in-laws or spouses. It's not uncommon for people to talk about family dynamics. And at first, it might seem like a lighthearted discussion about a TV drama or a funny story. But then minutes into the conversation, they suddenly take a hard turn, bringing up their family problems. Maybe they start talking about how their mother-in-law is difficult, comparing their real-life struggles to the fictional drama. "Oh, this reminds me of my mother-in-law. She's just like that character on TV," they'll say, before launching into a full-blown rant. What if the other person has had similar experiences with their mother-in-law? They might sympathize and even join in on the conversation. There's something oddly comforting about venting to someone who shares the same frustrations. Badmouthing a common enemy can sometimes create a sense of camaraderie and even intimacy between two people. But if the listener hasn't had the same experience, the conversation takes a nosedive. Instead of feeling like they're bonding over shared struggles, the listener begins to feel weighed down by the negativity. What was once a simple discussion about a TV show has now become a heavy and uncomfortable conversation, filled with complaints that they can't relate to. The problem with people who always steer the conversation toward their difficulties is that they don't stop to consider the feelings of the person they're talking to. They assume that just because they want to talk about their problems, the other person wants to hear about them. It's almost as if they're oblivious to the emotional impact their words have on others. They don't realize that constantly talking about negative experiences, especially ones that aren't shared, can be draining and off-putting. If you find yourself in a situation like this, where someone keeps bringing up the same old stories about their hardships, there are ways to gently steer the conversation in a different direction. One effective approach is to subtly remind them that you've heard the story before. Saying something like, "I think you've mentioned this to me before," can help them realize they're repeating themselves. It gives them a chance to pause and hopefully shift the conversation to something new. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment below to let me know that you are still here with me. But sometimes, even that doesn't work, and they continue to rehash the same stories over and over again. And in those cases, it might be necessary to be a bit more direct. You could say, "I've heard this story several times already, and I'd rather talk about something else." While it might feel uncomfortable to say something so blunt, it's important to set boundaries, especially if their constant negativity is affecting your emotional well-being. After all, repeating the same old stories not only shows a lack of respect for the listener, but also reflects poorly on the speaker, so it makes them come across as self-centered and inconsiderate, unaware of the impact their words have on others. At the end of the day, communication is about more than just talking. It's about listening, sharing, and connecting. But when one person dominates the conversation with their struggles, it becomes less of a dialogue and more of a monologue. If someone is constantly focused on their difficulties without regard for the other person's feelings or interests, the conversation becomes unbalanced, and the connection begins to fray. Over time, this can lead to emotional distance, as the listener feels more and more alienated by the one-sidedness of the interaction. While it's important to be there for our friends and loved ones when they're going through tough times, it's equally important to maintain a balance in our conversations. Sharing personal struggles can be a way of finding support and empathy, but it shouldn't dominate every interaction. If you find yourself becoming the sounding board for someone else's constant complaints, don't be afraid to gently guide the conversation in a different direction. And if necessary, set boundaries to protect your emotional health. After all, communication is meant to bring us closer, not to drive us apart. To handle a situation where someone continually talks about their difficulties, sometimes using humor can be a great way to diffuse the tension and gently shift the direction of the conversation. Humor can lighten the mood without coming across as too harsh or dismissive. For example, you might say something like, "Wow, this story is going to become a legend at this rate." This could prompt a laugh from both of you, and with any luck, it will steer the conversation towards something lighter and less focused on their struggles. Humor often works as a soft nudge that encourages people to reflect on their behavior without feeling criticized. But of course, this tactic isn't always foolproof. If humor doesn't work, it's perfectly okay to find a polite way to excuse yourself from the conversation or quickly shift the topic to something more engaging or relevant. You could bring up a new subject, ask a different question, or introduce a shared interest to guide the conversation in a new direction. One important thing to remember is that when someone repeats the same story multiple times, it not only confuses the listener, making it hard to stay engaged, but it also dulls the speaker's appeal. After a while, it becomes difficult to remain interested in someone who offers nothing new, and the relationship can begin to suffer. Mastering delicate communication techniques, knowing when to shift topics, how to introduce humor, and understanding others' emotional cues helps preserve relationships. It builds trust and fosters a deeper connection, ensuring that conversations remain enriching rather than exhausting. Now, let's talk about another type of challenging individual, the ones who don't listen. You've probably encountered this type of person in your life. They are the ones who seem to be present physically, but mentally, they're somewhere else entirely. These are the people who, when you're speaking, don't truly listen to what you're saying. Instead, they're often busy thinking of their next response or interrupting the natural flow of conversation. It's frustrating because these interruptions can make the entire discussion feel disjointed, and before you know it, the conversation veers off track. Sometimes they might even blatantly ignore what was said earlier and interject with a completely unrelated comment, leaving everyone around them feeling confused and taken aback. It's not uncommon for them to ask a question that's already been answered earlier in the conversation, creating an awkward atmosphere and highlighting just how disconnected they are. This behavior isn't just frustrating, it can lead to misunderstandings and create a sense of alienation among the people involved. And when these individuals start making claims without evidence or any substantial basis, the confusion only deepens. These communication gaps can easily spiral into full-blown misunderstandings, causing frustration and disconnect. Interestingly, these people who don't listen often fall into three distinct groups. The first group consists of people who lack basic understanding. They struggle to grasp the meaning or context of what's being said and often miss the bigger picture entirely. These individuals have a hard time comprehending stories, metaphors, or even straightforward communication. Because they don't understand the core message, they tend to derail the conversation with irrelevant counter-arguments. For example, if someone says, "Even if there are justifiable aspects to a terrorist act, it's still wrong," the person who doesn't listen might latch onto the phrase, "justifiable aspects," and completely miss the point that the speaker is condemning terrorism. This misinterpretation leads them to react emotionally to something that wasn't even the main point of the conversation, creating unnecessary confusion and misunderstandings. What makes this behavior particularly frustrating is that these people often focus on trivial details, losing sight of the main point. They might obsess over small, insignificant aspects of the discussion, blowing them out of proportion, while ignoring the more important context. For example, instead of understanding the overall message of a story, they'll get stuck on an example used to explain it and make that the focal point of their response. It's as if they're grasping at straws, desperately trying to find something to disagree with or critique, even when it's not relevant to the main discussion. This kind of communication makes conversations not only confusing but also unpleasant. It feels like every conversation turns into an uphill battle, where the main message gets lost in a sea of irrelevant distractions. The second group includes people who are overly focused on their own opinions. These individuals listen not to understand, but to find points of contradiction. Their goal is not to engage in a meaningful exchange, but rather to prove their viewpoint or defend their position, even when it's not under attack. They zero in on anything that challenges their beliefs and dismiss everything else, creating an atmosphere of defensiveness rather than dialogue. This kind of behavior stifles the natural flow of conversation, because it turns what could have been a healthy exchange of ideas into a confrontation. Rather than exploring new perspectives, they shut down the opportunity for growth and understanding by turning the conversation into a debate. The third group consists of those who interrupt constantly, either because they're overly eager to share their thoughts or because they're simply not paying attention to what's being said. These people don't let others finish their thoughts before jumping in with their own. This not only cuts the speaker off, but also disrupts the entire rhythm of the conversation. It can feel incredibly disrespectful to be interrupted, especially if you are in the middle of explaining something important. The interrupter often has no awareness of how frustrating this behavior can be for others. Conversations with these individuals can feel like a constant struggle to get a word in, and over time, this makes people less inclined to engage with them at all. In all three cases, whether it's due to a lack of understanding, a fixation on irrelevant details, or constant interruptions, the result is the same: a frustrating, disconnected conversation. When people don't listen, they miss the opportunity to connect on a deeper level, to truly understand where the other person is coming from. And that's the heart of meaningful communication, being able to not just speak, but also to listen, to empathize, and to engage fully with another person's thoughts and feelings. When someone doesn't listen, it's like they're only half participating in the conversation, and that leads to misunderstandings, confusion, and a lack of emotional connection. If you find yourself dealing with someone who constantly interrupts or misses the point, there are ways to gently guide the conversation back on track. One approach is to ask them questions that bring them back to the topic at hand, encouraging them to refocus on the main point. You can also try to clarify misunderstandings as they arise, helping to steer the conversation toward a more productive direction. But sometimes, the best approach is simply to model good listening behavior yourself. By showing patience, empathy, and a genuine interest in what the other person has to say, you can subtly encourage them to do the same. Ultimately, communication is a two-way street. It requires both speaking and listening, both sharing and understanding. When someone doesn't listen, it creates barriers to connection, making it difficult to build trust, intimacy, and mutual respect. But with the right approach, whether it's humor, gentle redirection, or clear boundaries, it's possible to foster healthier, more meaningful conversations that bring people closer together, rather than driving them apart. For instance, imagine someone saying, due to some people being unruly, airport baggage checks have become stricter, which might make the world more suspicious. Now, instead of understanding the overall message, someone in this group might jump in with a completely off-track question like, "Are you saying we shouldn't check baggage at all?" It's as if they've latched onto one part of the statement, missing the bigger picture entirely. And suddenly, the conversation is derailed. They might even go off on a tangent, turning it into a larger debate about the merits of security checks, rather than focusing on the main point of the discussion. These individuals tend to misunderstand or misinterpret statements because they aren't fully engaged in the conversation in the first place. Their minds are often occupied with their thoughts or concerns, so they don't absorb what others are saying. For these types of people, blending into conversations naturally can be incredibly challenging. Instead of smoothly contributing to the flow of dialogue, they often create disruptions. Sometimes they even unintentionally distract the other person, pulling the conversation in confusing or unrelated directions. What's most frustrating is their tendency to focus solely on topics that interest them. They might only give half-hearted responses or dismissive answers when someone brings up a topic outside of their interests. They're quick to switch the subject back to what they care about, often ignoring the original point entirely. This behavior leaves conversations feeling unbalanced and frankly unfulfilling, because it quickly becomes clear that they aren't interested in what others have to say. This self-centered communication style is particularly problematic in group settings. When people behave this way in social or organizational contexts, their lack of social skills becomes glaringly obvious. It's difficult to hold productive conversations or meetings with individuals who constantly steer discussions toward their interests or misunderstand the main point. This is why you'll rarely see such people thriving in group environments, They simply don't have the skills to engage meaningfully with others. Their selfish tendencies and inability to listen make it hard for colleagues, friends, or even family members to maintain close relationships with them. So over time, people distance themselves, leaving these individuals on the outskirts of social circles. The second group in this category consists of people who hold deeply ingrained prejudices. These individuals are not only resistant to change, but also stubbornly cling to their old thoughts and beliefs, often without clear reasons or evidence to back them up. Even when faced with well-argued, logical points from others, they refuse to listen. They reject new perspectives, preferring the comfort of their established opinions, regardless of how outdated or unfounded those opinions may be. And what makes this particularly difficult is that they often misunderstand or react defensively to harmless statements. For example, when someone is simply sharing a different opinion or offering an alternative viewpoint, these people take it personally as if any differing perspective is a direct attack on their character. And this kind of defensive reaction can quickly escalate into confrontation, where instead of having a healthy exchange of ideas, the conversation turns into a debate or argument. It's exhausting to talk to someone who isn't open to new ideas or differing opinions. They've already made up their minds, and no amount of reasoning or evidence will convince them otherwise. And what's worse, they don't even try to understand where the other person is coming from. Instead, they get upset and argumentative, believing that any challenge to their viewpoint is a personal offense. This type of person isn't interested in hearing others out. They're only interested in defending their position, no matter how irrational it may be. One of the key characteristics of these individuals is their inability to listen without interrupting. Even in conversations that aren't provocative or confrontational, they manage to find ways to interject with criticisms or counter-arguments. Rather than allowing the other person to fully explain their thoughts, they jump in to disagree, often without fully understanding what's being said. This kind of communication doesn't lead to understanding or connection. It leads to frustration and confusion. What they fail to realize is that listening is one of the most fundamental aspects of communication. Simply allowing the other person to speak, taking the time to understand their perspective, and then responding thoughtfully can do wonders for building connections and avoiding misunderstandings. But for this group of people, the idea of truly listening and absorbing what others are saying seems completely foreign. Instead of listening to understand, they listen to respond, often before the other person has even finished speaking. This knee-jerk reaction creates a communication breakdown and, more often than not, causes unnecessary misunderstandings. In both of these groups, those who misunderstand and those who hold on to prejudices, the common trait is an inability or unwillingness to listen. And they don't see the value in taking the time to understand the other person's perspective before jumping to conclusions or forming opinions. This lack of listening doesn't just make conversations difficult, it also breaks down the connection between people. Communication is more than just talking, it's about creating understanding and empathy. So when someone doesn't listen, when they're too caught up in their thoughts or too rigid in their beliefs, the chance for meaningful dialogue is lost. Conversations with these individuals often feel more like battles or struggles rather than exchanges of ideas. It's frustrating, it's exhausting, and over time it leads to feelings of disconnect. The sad reality is that these behaviors create barriers to deeper relationships and trust. When someone doesn't feel heard or understood, it's hard to build intimacy or closeness. Listening is one of the most powerful ways we can show respect, care, and interest in others. But when that's missing, when one person dominates or derails the conversation, the relationship begins to suffer. Misunderstandings pile up, resentment builds, and soon enough, the connection between people starts to fray. To avoid this, it's crucial to practice active listening in conversations. That means not just hearing the words, but understanding the emotions, intentions, and thoughts behind them. It means being fully present in the moment, setting aside our preconceptions, and truly engaging with what the other person is saying. And it means being open to different viewpoints, even if they challenge our own. In the end, communication is a two-way street. It's about speaking and listening, sharing and understanding. Those who refuse to listen or who misunderstand create distance rather than connection. But with a little effort, a willingness to listen, and an open mind, we can all become better communicators and in turn build stronger, more meaningful relationships with those around us. Making counter-arguments that have little to do with the actual topic at hand is often a sign of ignorance or a lack of understanding. It reflects a person's inability or unwillingness to fully listen to what's being said before forming their response. The result is often a conversation that veers off course, filled with irrelevant points and a lack of real engagement. Only when we genuinely listen to and understand others' perspectives can we build well-rounded, reasonable opinions of our own. But there's a deeper issue at play with some individuals. Discrimination, whether subtle or overt, can often permeate their speech without them even realizing it. They may not recognize how their words carry bias, even when their intentions seem harmless. What's particularly interesting is how many of these people claim that they aren't biased. They might go to great lengths to emphasize that they don't mean to discriminate, yet the way they express themselves reveals otherwise. They often exaggerate or blend facts with non-facts to create the illusion of being fair-minded. They don't recognize that discrimination can seep into their language and attitudes in subtle, insidious ways. For example, someone might start a statement with, "I don't mean to discriminate," only to follow up with something like, "But those people are just different from us." The contradiction is clear. Despite their claim of neutrality, their language is riddled with implicit bias. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. This kind of speech often comes across as defensive, as if the speaker knows on some level that what they're saying isn't entirely appropriate. They might even lower their voice when making these statements, as though they're anxious about how their words might be received. Or perhaps they feel a twinge of dishonesty in their message. This lowering of the voice often happens when they know, deep down, that their comments are not entirely fair or considerate, but they proceed anyway unaware or unwilling to face the reality that they are contributing to a discriminatory mindset. The particularly common scenario is when people say, "I don't mean to discriminate, but," and then follow it up with remarks that suggest exactly the opposite. Even when they try to qualify their statements by saying, "They're just like us," this kind of phrasing can unintentionally emphasize a separation between groups. It creates a subtle yet powerful message that says, "They're not quite the same as us," which reinforces prejudice rather than breaking it down. The act of emphasizing similarity, when it's done with this kind of language, actually highlights the perceived differences, making the conversation about us versus them. I remember reading a very thoughtful article that addressed this exact issue. The story involved a small business owner who, with seemingly good intentions, welcomed workers from Southeast Asia. He proudly claimed that he treated them with the same compassion as household workers, framing this as a point of pride. In an attempt to show affection or inclusion, he gave these workers Japanese nicknames, thinking it was a kind gesture. However, what he failed to recognize was that all of these workers already had their names that reflected their personal identities, cultures, and backgrounds. Giving them Japanese names wasn't a sign of fairness or compassion. It was a subtle but clear form of discrimination. By renaming them, he was essentially erasing part of who they were, forcing them into a mold that fit his cultural comfort zone, rather than respecting their individuality. This small but significant act revealed a deeper prejudice that the business owner wasn't even aware of. His actions reflected an inability to fully accept the diversity and unique values of the workers. He thought he was being kind, but his behavior showed that he still held onto biases, unable to completely respect the differences that these workers brought with them. It's a reminder that discrimination often lives in the small details of our actions and words, not just an overt prejudice. These subtle differences in how we treat others can speak volumes about our underlying attitudes. The problem with this kind of unintentional discrimination is that it has far-reaching effects, both personally and socially. When people don't realize they are being discriminatory, they often hurt those around them without even knowing it. This can strain personal relationships, as the person on the receiving end of the discrimination may feel devalued, misunderstood, or disrespected. Over time, these small slights can accumulate, leading to feelings of exclusion and alienation. In broader terms, this lack of awareness weakens social cohesion. It creates divides between groups and fosters an environment where empathy and mutual understanding are harder to come by. One of the greatest challenges in addressing this issue is that many people believe they are not biased or discriminatory simply because they don't intend to be. But discrimination isn't just about intention, it's about impact. The words we use, the actions we take, and the small decisions we make every day all contribute to either building bridges between people or reinforcing walls of division. Even if someone means well, if their actions reflect outdated or prejudiced thinking, they're still contributing to a culture of inequality. True acceptance and respect for others come not just from saying the right things, but from living those values through our actions. It's not enough to claim that we treat people equally. We need to actively reflect on how our words and behaviors affect others. Are we truly embracing the differences that make people unique, or are we subtly trying to force them into categories that make us more comfortable? Are we listening to others' experiences with an open mind, or are we clinging to our perspectives because they feel safer? Building a society free from discrimination requires more than just good intentions. It requires us to constantly question our assumptions, challenge our biases, and be willing to learn from those who are different from us. Accepting and respecting differences means not only saying the right things, but also taking real action to honor those differences. Whether it's something as simple as using someone's real name instead of giving them a nickname that feels more familiar to us, or as complex as rethinking the way we view certain groups of people, every action matters. Embracing new perspectives, values, and ways of life is the key to eliminating discrimination. It's about moving beyond mere tolerance and toward true acceptance. When we open ourselves to learning from others, we not only enrich our own lives, but also contribute to creating a society that is more compassionate, empathetic, and unified. The more we embrace diversity in both thought and action, the closer we get to building a truly free and harmonious world, one where everyone feels valued, respected, and seen for who they truly are. The fifth type of person that we often encounter in social and professional circles is the one who can't stand hearing others being praised. So these individuals, who often have inflated self-esteem, tend to brag about themselves without even realizing it. The moment they hear someone else being complimented, their demeanor shifts, their expressions turn sour, and they might immediately attempt to downplay or belittle the person receiving praise. Whether the person being recognized is a close friend or just an acquaintance, these individuals feel intense discomfort at the thought of someone else being admired. And they might dismiss the achievement with phrases like, "Anyone could do that." It's nothing special, as a way of deflecting the attention away from the other person's success. It's not just that they feel uncomfortable when others are praised, they feel threatened. Their fear of being overshadowed pushes them to react negatively, even if they don't always show it outwardly. Sometimes, instead of outwardly criticizing, they force themselves to give a compliment, but it's clear to everyone that it's insincere. Their resistance to acknowledging someone else's achievements is written all over their face, even when they try to hide it. What makes it more complicated is their tendency to insert their past successes into unrelated conversations. You might be discussing something entirely different, but they'll find a way to bring up how well they performed in the past. They aren't sharing stories for the sake of conversation. They're trying to affirm their worth, to subtly imply, "I could have done that too, maybe even better." This behavior becomes especially noticeable when the person being praised is someone close to them, perhaps a co-worker or a sibling. They struggle to genuinely recognize the other person's achievements. Even when they do offer a compliment, it's laced with a kind of forced admiration that feels awkward and unnatural. It's as though they're saying, "I have to acknowledge this, but I don't believe it." Deep down, these individuals have a habit of undervaluing their skills while simultaneously overestimating how easy certain tasks are for them. They take on work believing it to be simple, often because they don't fully appreciate the complexity involved. Their overconfidence leads them to think they can handle it effortlessly, so they're quick to accept tasks that, in reality, require more attention and skill than they are willing to give. As a result, the quality of their work often falls short. What they believed would be easy turns out to be more challenging than anticipated, and the final product rarely meets expectations. Over time, people around them begin to notice that their output is either incomplete or lacks the quality necessary to get the job done well. This, of course, isn't surprising when people overestimate their abilities and fail to truly understand the requirements of a task. Their work inevitably suffers. But what makes it more frustrating is that, when confronted with criticism, these individuals never take full responsibility for their shortcomings. Instead, they find excuses to explain away their failures. They might say something like, "I couldn't finish the project on time because my father was sick," and I had to go home or I was distracted by other responsibilities. While these excuses might sound reasonable at first, the pattern becomes clear over time. They consistently shift the blame onto external factors rather than admit their lack of preparedness or skill. This behavior doesn't stop there. They may even brag about how, had the circumstances been more favorable, they would have excelled. Even if the project had been more suitable for my skills, I would have done great, they might claim, further distancing themselves from the reality of their inadequacies. And rather than facing their weaknesses and working to improve, they use these excuses as a shield to protect their fragile ego. By making such statements, they continue to reinforce the illusion that they are capable without actually addressing the root of the problem. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment below to let me know that you are still here with me. The real issue with people like this is that they are trapped in a cycle of self-deception. When someone offers them honest feedback, saying something like, "You don't have the necessary skills for this job, you need to improve," they don't take it constructively. Instead, they get defensive and angry. Behind the scenes, they may even complain to others, saying things like, "They don't understand my true value." It's as if they are constantly battling against the reality of their limitations, refusing to confront the truth. What's happening beneath the surface is that these individuals often have a deep-seated lack of confidence. Despite their outward displays of arrogance, they are deeply insecure and terrified of acknowledging their shortcomings. Because they are so desperate to avoid facing their weaknesses, they choose to cover them up with bragging and inflated stories of past success. It's easier for them to maintain an image of superiority than it is to admit that they have room to grow. They are more concerned with how others perceive them than with actually improving themselves. Their self-worth is tied entirely to the image they project to others, and they will go to great lengths to protect that image, even if it means avoiding real challenges or opportunities for growth. In the end, these individuals not only build walls around themselves, but they also lose the trust and respect of those around them. People quickly realize that they aren't willing to listen to feedback or acknowledge their flaws. Instead of being open to self-improvement, they cling to a fantasy of superiority that ultimately isolates them from others. Their refusal to engage in genuine self-reflection prevents them from forming deeper, more meaningful connections. They may think they are protecting themselves by maintaining a facade of competence, but in reality, they are setting themselves up for repeated failure. What's most tragic about this behavior is that it creates a vicious cycle. The more they avoid facing their weaknesses, the more they fail to improve. And the more they fail, the more they feel the need to protect their fragile ego through bragging and excuses. This spiral of self-deception leaves them stuck, unable to grow, and gradually alienates the people around them. True growth and self-worth come from recognizing our limitations, learning from our mistakes, and striving to do better. But for people trapped in the fantasy of their superiority, this kind of growth feels out of reach. Instead of maintaining this facade, it would be far more beneficial for them to embrace humility. By acknowledging that they aren't perfect, they could open themselves up to real improvement. It's only by accepting constructive criticism and working on our weaknesses that we can become better, not just in our abilities, but in our relationships with others. But until they are willing to confront the truth about themselves, these individuals will remain stuck in a cycle of overconfidence, self-doubt, and ultimately, self-failure. As we wrap up, take a moment to reflect on everything we've discussed. What have you learned so far? Is there something that resonated with you about the different types of people who struggle with listening, self-awareness, or handling praise? Think about one thing you've learned from this video that you can bring into your own life, whether it's about recognizing these behaviors in others or reflecting on how we might improve ourselves. I encourage you to comment below on the one takeaway you'll put into practice. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more insightful content like this.